All right, can you hear me now, guys? Can you hear me? Yay, there we go. Lots of yeses. Thank you, guys. Okay, cool. All right, I'll start again. My name is Warren Rendon. I'm the head of CAS 360 here at BGL, and welcome to the Director ID webinar. Now, before we start, the session is recorded. Okay, so we are recording the session. We will be sending it out to everyone. There are some important links in the content, so we definitely want you to get your hands on this. What I'm going to go through today, it might be a bit of a summary of stuff that you may have seen. We are going to introduce Director ID, talk a bit about the basics of Director ID, and then we're going to talk about some of the changes that have happened. The nature of Director ID is that it's a piece of legislation that actually has a whole set of trigger dates that take effect. One obviously on the 5th of April, another one on the 30th of November. And what we want to do is really get you up to speed with where the Director ID project is at and where and when these particular triggers come in and what you need to know and what you need to do to help your clients with this. We'll also cover off on the CAS 360 features that we'll be showing as part of Director ID, and then also a little bit of an update on the ABRS in 2023. The reason why I want to talk about this is because this links back in to why we're doing Director ID, or a big part of Director ID is this whole ABRS feature. I will take questions. Hopefully people can hear, again, some in the chat, but if you do have any questions, please let me know. In the Q&A, that's where I want you to ask the questions. The chat, I can't quite keep up with the chat. There's a lot going on. So if you do have any questions, put it in the Q&A. So let's get into Director ID. So what we're going to cover off here is who, what, the obligations, a bit of an update, and then I'm going to talk a bit about enforcement, because enforcement is really important and it is the latest step that we all need to know about. So let's go back right to the start. Director ID started on the 1st of November 2021. It is a unique identifier that company directors will keep forever. Really important that it's a unique identifier. It's very similar to obviously an ACN, an ABN, in that it is a number that is going to be linked to that particular person for all of their directorships. And all directors are required by law to verify their identity with the ABRS before receiving a Director ID. So fundamentally, the Director ID is about identifying the people that are running companies in Australia. Some of you who have been in CorpSec for a long time will know that there are hundreds of Homer Simpsons and Fred Flintstones running companies in Australia. They are directors that no one knows who they are. So a big part of this is obviously identifying these directors, making sure that they're real people, and making sure that we know exactly who the people are, or at least the ABRS know exactly who the people are that are running companies in Australia. So who does this apply to? And again, we're starting basic, but it will get a bit more advanced. So you need a Director ID if you are an eligible officer of a company, a registered body, or a registered foreign company under the Corporations Act, or an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander corporation under the CATSI Act. So that's the starting point. An eligible officer is a person who is appointed as a director or an alternate director. Okay, so secretaries are exempt. If you are a director or an alternate director, then you need to get a Director ID. One thing that is really important and I need to make really clear is if you are an Australian company director living overseas, you are not exempt. You are required to get a Director ID. Now, this can cause all sorts of challenges, but the reality is if they are a director of an Australian company, they must get a Director ID. There are no exemptions. So then it's all about when these dates come into effect. And some of them have passed. So as I mentioned, it all started on the 1st of November, when anyone that was appointed for the first time as a director from the 1st of November to the 4th of April had 28 days within the appointment date. That has now ceased. So now there are only 2 dates that you need to know. If they were a director before the 31st of October, then they have until the 30th of November. So if this particular person is an existing director and they were an existing director on or before the 31st of October, then their deadline for the director ID is the 30th of November, 2022. If this particular person is becoming a director for the first time, really important, for the first time, from today onwards or from the 5th of April onwards, they must have their director ID before appointment, okay? Before they are appointed, they must have a director ID. So it is really clear. The way you need to know this is, was that particular person a director on or before the 31st of October? If yes, their deadline is the 30th of November. If no, they must have a director ID now to become a director, okay? If it's a CATSI Act, there are slightly different deadlines on or before 30th of November. It is the 30th of November, 2023, actually. And from November this year, 2022, it's before appointment. Obviously, I put that in there for some of you that may administer those companies, but the majority will obviously be Corporations Act related. And this is a point I need to make really, really clear. If you were already a director on or before the 31st of October, 2021, you have until the 30th of November. So I'll put it in twice in a row to clear up any confusion. It's really important that existing directors get longer, okay? It's the new directors that have to be acted on now. So how do you get your director ID? The preferred method is obviously online via MyGov. Okay, and to do this, you'll need to have ID documents ready and also TFN and tax information ready. Okay, so MyGov ID is the way to go through that process electronically and online and complete the process, hopefully quickly. There are telephone support and things like that is available to help you go through that process. But if you are unaware about how your clients are supposed to do this, MyGov ID is the preferred method. There are obviously going to be outliers. There's going to be people that aren't tech savvy. There's going to be people that don't own computers. So in those cases, there are alternatives. And here it just depends for Australian residents and non-Australian residents. For Australian residents, it is best to call the ABRS via the ABRS numbers. Now, as I said, I will send these slides out, so you will get them all, but it is the standard phone number for ABRS, and you can get it from their website. That's the preferred method if the person is an Australian resident. What they will effectively do on the phone is they will go through the process of verifying your ID. So again, you'll still need to have those ID documents and tax information handy, okay? But you are going to be able to do it over the phone. So for those of you, and I know this is a very common question that we get a lot, the majority of your clients are going to be able to do it through MyGov ID, but there will be clients that cannot do that for a range of reasons. So there is a way that they can do it over the phone. The ABRS will insist that the person is there, so you can't do it for someone. It is an offence to apply for a director ID for someone else, but they certainly can do it in a way that is over the phone and a bit easier. For those that are non-residents, there is a form. There is a paper-based form that can go out. Obviously, again, they might be able to try through MyGov ID, but there is a paper-based form as well. Again, that's on the ABRS website. It will be linked in the slide pack as well. So there are a couple of different options and alternatives available to you. Yes, there definitely is this session is being recorded. You will get a copy of the slides and of the action replay. A couple of questions that I'll jump into. There's a few that are long, so I might struggle to get to them. Andy and Jeremy are helping me with questions, and hopefully they can answer some of the more longer ones. For a registered foreign branch which has a company listed as a director, does this company need to obtain a DIN if they are recorded as a director? So Madeline, the answer is yes. If it is a registered foreign company which falls under the Corporations Act, then they will, and they are a director of that company, then yes, they will require a director ID. So hopefully that answers that question. Will new director appointments be rejected by ASIC if the director ID has not been applied for? I might cover this a little bit later, but I will just mention it now. there is no link between ASIC and the ABRS that do the director ID system. That might shock some of you. That might not shock many of you. But essentially, no, you still will be able to lodge that 484. You still will be able to lodge that 201. However, when I get to enforcement, I'll explain exactly what the ABRS will do in that case. Okay, so ASIC won't reject the lodgement. They will accept the lodgement. Okay, so just be aware of that. Does this include directors that become a director of a new company? Yeah, so in the case of a new company, it goes back to if that person is already a director as of the 31st of October. So we might be incorporating a new company today on the 28th of April. If that person was a director on the 31st of October 2021 or before then they are not required to get their director ID until the 30th of November. Okay, so it all depends if they were a director before that date or not. Okay. A question here about dealing with name changes and things like that. That's all part of the identity verification process. So that is usually done via MyGovID. If a person is able, they just need to be able to prove their identity via a drive. It's very similar to your standard government identities, but if you've got a driver's license, a passport, things like that, as long as the name matches, you'll be able to go through the process of getting a director ID. Please be aware at the moment, you don't need to worry about changes of names and things like that. If you can verify your identity today, then you'll get your director ID. Maintenance will happen in the future. A lot of questions, but I'll keep pushing through. I'll talk a little bit here about obligations. So all company directors are required to. So this is the obligation of every company director, and it's really the part that registered agents need to convey to these directors, because to be honest, they probably won't know. So all company directors are required to apply for a director ID within the relevant time frame for them. Okay, it is a requirement of them. They need to. If they don't do that, then it will fall into the next category, which is apply for a director ID when directed by the registrar. Okay, so we had a question before about ASIC rejecting the 484. Well, they won't reject the 484 to a point, they will accept it. And then it's likely that the ABRS will get in contact with that director and tell them to get a director ID. Okay, that's not the situation we want to be in. I don't think it's great that that government bodies will be contacting your directors without you. I think it would be much better if it was you that was contacting them and telling them about this requirement. But certainly if they are directed by the registrar, then they have to do it. You're not allowed to apply for more than one director ID. That is an offence, and there's pretty big penalties. You're not to misrepresent your director ID. So you're not to provide a fake one or anything like that. You're not to breach any of the director ID guidelines. And if you cannot apply for a director ID in time, you are to apply for an extension. Okay, so there's some obligations here, but really the main obligation is every company director needs to get a director ID via or in the relevant time frame. Privacy is an interesting topic around director IDs, and a lot of people are getting a little bit concerned with the actual director ID number and sharing that number and using that number. So in regards to director IDs, it is considered private in that the government body, the ABRS, are not allowed to issue or publicise director ID numbers. Okay, they are only allowed to give director ID numbers to the directors themselves. This obviously makes it very difficult for us as agents, because under the legislation, the ABRS, the government body, is not able to give us, the registered agents, the director IDs of our clients. Okay. Don't worry, I've got into a lot of arguments about that one, but at the moment, that's how the legislation sits. The director, however, is free to provide that information to anyone. So here, it's not about the privacy of the information, it's about the disclosure. So the ABRS are not allowed to disclose it to us, the software company, or you, the registered agent, but the directors are. Agents are allowed to store this information in their systems. Software applications are allowed to share the director IDs via APIs. and director IDs are not treated in the same way as a TFN. Okay, so it's really important that there isn't any extra layer of security like there is with the TFN with the director ID. I suppose the restriction is on the ABRS. It's not on the directors, it's not on the agents, it's actually on the ABRS. So in terms of where the project is at, or where director IDs are at now, currently there's about 460,000 director IDs that have been issued. Okay, so we're starting to see some numbers coming on board, and what's great to see is the numbers increasing in February and March, and hopefully in April, which I haven't got the numbers for yet because we haven't finished. But as you can see, a lot of director IDs being issued. Hopefully, a lot of those are your director IDs being issued, or your client's director IDs being issued. But as you can see, 460,000. Of those issued, around 90% are existing directors. So existing directors getting in early, getting their IDs, sorted out so that there's no hassles come November this year. And around 10% of those that are required to get them, obviously previously within the 28 days, but now before becoming a director. So about 10% is about the similar number to the amount of directors that are coming onto the companies. So total known directors is around 2.5 million. So we're around 20% of the way through the process. What that means is there's a lot of work to do in the next 6 months to get that 80%, right? And this is where a lot of that work is going to fall on you as agents, contacting your company directors and helping them meet their requirements. I've got these, I don't have the stats for April, but in March, we were getting, or the ABRS were getting 35,000 calls to their help desk around this. About 92% of those director IDs are being done through the MyGov ID process, about 6% over the phone, and about 2% by paper. A huge amount of website views and a huge amount of processing being done from the start of this year, which is really good. But as you can see, there are 3 methods to how you can get your director ID, but MyGov ID website is by far the most used. And now we get to the important topic of enforcement. And this is a really important part of where the project is at and what has changed since implementation. So it says here that the director ID enforcement started in March 2022. So from November 1st to March, it was hands off, okay? You were able to complete your work without any sort of, I suppose, intervention from the ABRS. From March onwards, the ABRS are now much more active and actively watching who is being appointed as company directors. So obviously the enforcement is solely focused on people that are becoming company directors for the first time, because the existing directors are still within their rights. They've got until the 30th of November. But anyone that is becoming a director for the first time is falling into this enforcement bucket. And what is happening is every time a director is being added, the ABRS are checking to make sure that that person is, if they are an existing director or if they are a new director. And if they are a new director, the ABRS are checking to see if they have completed their director ID requirements. Okay, so enforcement is happening. What is then happening is if the ABRS are able to find that person has not completed their director ID requirements, they are being letters sent out. Okay, so letters are being sent out first of all to the directors to tell them that they have not met their requirements. There are also letters being sent out to tax agents and registered agents. You may have seen one was sent out recently, but they are communicating with the tax agents, the registered agents, and the directors themselves. To date, there are no fines that have been issued, but I think you might get a bit scared when you see the size of these fines. Fines can be issued under the legislation. Also, there's some pretty serious penalties here, but right now there are no fines that have been issued. However, I wouldn't want to run the gauntlet. I think that the ABRS are looking for a test case or two. So I wouldn't be running the gauntlet if I were you. I would be strongly encouraging strongly encouraging you to get all of your new company directors to complete their ID requirements before you put them on the register. Someone says, tell me the fines, son. They're coming. The director ID enforcement. So I'll talk a little bit about how this enforcement is happening. ABRS is contacting those directors to make them aware of their obligation and encouraging them to apply. Initially, the ABRS's focus is on education and awareness and helping directors do the right thing. The registrar may take firmer compliance actions and can issue directors with a direction to apply for their director ID. Okay. Directors who do not meet their obligation after being contacted may be referred to ASIC, who are responsible for enforcing director ID offences, which can span criminal and civil penalties. You want to see the penalties? Here we go. So penalties are huge. It is $13,200 for an individual and up to 1.1 million for a company. So these fall into a couple of different buckets where there's a failure to have a director ID when required to do so, failure to apply when directed by the registrar, applying for multiple director IDs, and misrepresenting a director ID. Obviously, the applying for multiple director IDs could put you in jail. So there's some very severe penalty here on the directors. Okay, so you can see here, there are a huge amount of penalties that are available, and effectively they would go through the courts, okay, to take those penalties. And these are obviously just the legislated penalty bans, okay. So Nicholas, there's the fines. Hopefully that helps you, but there are some very significant fines that are available. Now, I'm going to have a look at some of the questions to make sure there's a lot coming through here. It's a question here that's obviously really important. What is the role and responsibility of ASIC agents here once we have already reminded the directors enough times? There are no penalties for agents in this instance, right? Purely it is a goal of you as the agent to help your client meet their requirements. I don't believe, unless you are acting poorly and really not helping, I don't think there will be any penalties for agents at all. The penalties are for the directors. The directors are the ones that are stealing, so I'm reading a question. The directors are the ones that are not completing their requirements, and they are the ones that are going to be penalized. So there's some really big penalties here. And what we're trying to do here is really educate you as agents so that you are in the best position to get on the front foot and communicate to these particular directors and make sure that they are meeting their requirements, and that come December 1st, there's not an avalanche of complaints about your practice for not helping these directors. So really from us, we want to make sure that you are aware of the penalties, aware of the potential downside for these company directors so that we can get this out. A couple of other questions here. Has BGL compiled a follow-up email? Gail, yes, we do, and I'll show you the follow-up email. So there is in CAS 360 an initial email and a follow-up email that you can send over and over again. And there's a couple of other things that I'll show in the software so that you can touch on that. Right, a couple of other questions. A couple of people saying they're going to send some reminders out. Other than fines, will directors face being removed as a director for failing to get their ID? Janet, I would focus at the moment on the financial penalties. Without going into the legislation completely, I believe there might be some clauses for that, but certainly I think that'll be more of a court thing. They might be just disqualified as a director, but again, I'm maybe just making that up. Can a company be fined for a director not having a director ID? Again, that comes down to the individual circumstances. Okay, there are penalties for both individuals and for companies. Okay, so there are penalties there. It does depend on the particular circumstances there. Is there a template letter for clients? Yes, I'm going to get to that. That's exactly what we're going to show you. Do we have SMSs for director IDs? Not yet, but it's a good idea. What constitutes misrepresenting a DIN? Harrison, I would maybe guess providing fake ID. I'm not 100% sure. Couple of questions here. We have had directors set up their MyGov ID and follow the instructions and registered without their middle names, despite the fact that their directorships include middle names on ASIC. How do we rectify this and prevent this from occurring again? It's a really interesting question. Middle names is obviously a big issue with identity and ASIC and things like that. I'd be rather confident in saying that as long as the person has reasonably gone through the process and completed their director ID, the middle names issue will sort itself out when we get to the ABRS stage, which will be in 2023, where effectively we will be linking a director's appointment to their director ID. And from there, a lot of those niggly issues around names will be resolved. Even if it's a spelling mistake by a letter or something like that, those name issues are going to be resolved once we get to a linking position where we're going to be able to link the two systems together. As I mentioned earlier, the two systems are actually separated. There's the company register and there's the director ID register. And in 2023, they're coming together. Can these penalties be listed on the reminder email? Absolutely, you can customize the email. They're not on the stock email that we issue, but maybe we can make them a bit scarier. I think that maybe directors seeing the fines might make them move a little bit quicker. Lots of questions coming through, but I will move on and I'll answer a lot of those questions coming up at the end. You may have seen this email come out to you. This is the director ID email that was sent out to tax agents and registered agents. Okay, so you may have seen this one. Hopefully you haven't seen the letters that were sent out to directors, but if you have, they certainly do cover off a very similar message. So what do you need to know for the next 6 months? And this is where we get to the core once we've been educated about where or what director ID is, where it's at today, and the enforcement steps. Now let's talk about that next 6 months. So as of the 5th of April, which, as you know, was a few weeks ago, before we had all the public holidays and 3 long weekends, you cannot appoint a director for the first time without a director ID. So if someone comes into your practice today and wants to register a company or be added as a director of a company, and you ask them the question, are you an existing company director? And they say no, they must get a director ID before you complete that appointment. Okay, it's a change to the processes. It's a change to the process that I know that we've gone through for 30 years. But this is a change that is now live, happens today, and you need to be really clear with those directors that they are required to get that director ID. Now, in the next update, in CAS 360, there'll be some processes that will prompt, but it's a little bit hard because a person can be appointed as a director and there's that check if they are an existing director or not. And sometimes in CAS 360, if they're a director with another agent, we won't actually know. So it will need to be sort of a manual check that you'll need to make sure that you are doing with these directors. And it might mean asking 1 or 2 or 3 more questions, okay, to make sure that those directors that are coming on board are going to meet their requirements. And again, if you do make that appointment, there's not going to be any instant penalty. But what it will mean is that eventually the enforcement will catch up and there will be a letter sent out to that director. So really, as agents, we're trying to intercept that director getting that letter. So be really clear from today or from the 5th of April, any new appointment must, if they're not an existing director, they must have a director ID before you do the lodgement. Now, every company director by November 2022 must have a director ID. There will be no exceptions. And I know there's another question here about foreign companies. There will be no exceptions. If you are a director or an alternate director of a foreign company, if you are a director or an alternate director of an Australian company, but you live overseas, the legislation still applies to you. So from 30th of November 2022, everyone, every company director must have a director ID. Okay. Now, today you can manage this through the CAS 360 alert. You can remind clients via the CAS 360 email. You can obviously cross-check via the director ID report. I'm going to show you all of this in a minute. But also I encourage you to use the annual review process to promote the director ID. This is the process that you get to communicate with your company every year. It's an existing process. In CAS 360, we have put the ABRS letter into that annual review pack. We've also put a director ID alert on the annual review process. Okay, so you've got it sitting there, and it's simply a toggle to send that out. So by November 30, every company director must apply for a director ID. This is the end of the transition. Okay, so the transition process ends on the 30th of November 2022, and from the 1st of December 2022, it will be an offence to have not applied for a director ID. Okay, so we're really got to get all of these companies, all these company directors on board and make sure that the director is completing their ID requirements by the 30th of November. A couple of things that are really important to be aware of. There are no changes to ASIC forms. Forms like 201, 484, 490, etc. There are no director ID fields being added to those forms. You do not submit director ID data to ASIC. Okay, it is only, ASIC is for the forms, ABRS is for the director ID. The director ID number will not appear on annual reviews or ASIC data downloads or anything like that. Okay, and the director ID is not required to be provided to ASIC really at all unless they're conducting an investigation, basically. So there is no submission of this director ID data to ASIC. I hope that helps set up you for what you need to know about what is coming up for the next 6 months. There are a lot of questions. I think there's still 44 unanswered questions. We'll do our best to answer them. If you don't get a typed response, I'll answer some questions at the end. But what I want to do now is show you some of this features and functionality in CAS 360 to help you manage this and to help you get on top of this if it's a problem for your clients, and make sure that you are really being someone that assists these company directors in meeting this obligation. So the first thing I'll jump into CAS 360, and let's have a look at some of this functionality. Now, again, some of you may have seen this before. Some of you may be using this, and I really hope that a lot of you are. But let's go through it. So on your company selection screen, on the left-hand side, we have a director ID alert button. And here you have your companies broken up into different alerts. Okay, so you might have a few that are still left over by that required in 28 days, but really by the 5th of May, no companies will fall into that bucket because that transition period will be over. Then you'll have all of the companies that are required by November 2022. Now, hopefully you have a lot of these companies because it means you've still got a bit of time. You also have your overdue companies. Now, these are ones that have had a director appointed recently, or ones that have had their 28 days expire. So really, we don't want to have too many that are in that overdue section. And then we hope we have a lot in the completed green section. So you can obviously click on those. If I want to have a look at the companies that are required by November 2022, simple click like all your filters, drill down and see that data. You want to have a look at the ones that have got a director that their ID is late. Again, click on that and it will filter down. So for those that are required by November 2022, there are 2 emails that we send in CAS 360. So if I go over to my alert, I put my mouse over the alert and it says this particular company has 2 directors that do not have a director ID. So I click on go to director IDs. And what I'm looking for here is this blue box. Okay, this blue box will allow me to notify all of my directors in this company of their director ID requirements. Now, obviously, we will need an email address for all of the directors. If you haven't got the email address, you can actually add it from this screen. So you are able to add the director ID to this screen. Oh, sorry, not the director ID, but the email address for that contact. for the screen. You can also put your mouse over the eye and have a look at the details of that person. You can also put your mouse over that particular, under that person where it says director of other companies, and you can see the other companies that that person is a director of. So what we've got here is all of the directors, their email address, and if they are a director of other companies, it will be highlighted. Now with this blue box, what we're going to be able to do is click on send now, and this will send the initial email. So the blue box is for the initial email. This will send the initial email to the directors that obviously don't have an ID. Those that do will be exempt. So I click on send now, and up comes my email template that says introducing your director ID requirements. Now this is an email that we have written, and I'll show you how to customize it. This is an email that we have written. It'll pre-fill that particular client's name. It will also pre-fill all of the companies they are also a director of in your system. So if that person is a company director for multiple companies, all of those companies will be listed here. They are only required to get the director ID once. They're not required to get it per company. It is only once. We also here try and talk about the director ID requirements, how to get your director ID, and some information about what MyGovID is, and then obviously some buttons that will take you through. So this is a templated email that we have written that is available to all of you, okay? And what I'm able to do is hit send, and that will send that email off to my clients. And that is the initial email, and that is how you essentially initially communicate this out. All right, so that's step one, the initial email. And then step two is about the reminder email. So hopefully a lot of you have started sending out that initial email. If you haven't, no time better to start than now. And once you've sent out that initial email, I guess you can wait for a little bit, and then it's time to start sending the reminders out. So maybe you're getting to, August, September, October, and you're getting a little nervous, and you might want to send a reminder. So what you can do is click on go to director IDs. With the reminders, you're sending them out per person. So instead of sending them out in bulk for this particular company, you can send it out just to Mary, and up comes your email, and hit send. And that will send that email, that reminder out to just Mary, okay? Now, hopefully these directors get their IDs back to you, and you can click on add director ID, and you can just simply key that director ID in. That will save it to that particular contact's record, okay? And it will be permanently saved in CAS 360 connected to that particular person, right? So you've got the ability to add that director ID in. You've also got the due date here, but the alert obviously powers the due date as well. Right, someone's just asked if I could replay how to do the original email. So the original email is the same process. You go to the director ID alert, click on go to director IDs, and what you're looking for is just this blue box at the top. Okay, if you get the blue box where it's got notify all directors, this will send the email to all the directors that you obviously have an email address for. If we don't have an email address, we can't send the email, but you just click send now on that box, and that is your initial email. So as you can see, initial email and reminder email. Obviously, the question I'm getting here a few times is, can you send just a bulk blanket email? At the moment, we don't support that, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is sending a bulk email, unless you've got a perfect database with everyone's email address in, it's just not going to go to anyone, right? So you could click the button, the magic button that says send everyone an email. But if you don't have their email address in, you're not going to be able to deliver that email. You're just going to get a whole heap of, as you can see in the automation report sometimes, a whole heap of emails didn't send because there was no email. So the reason we do it per company, and you can only send the initial email per company, is because essentially you need to go into that particular company, make sure you've got email addresses for all the contacts, okay? Make sure you've got email addresses for all the contacts, and then you can send the initial email, and then you can send reminders. Also, CAS 360 is a very big product now. We've got a lot of clients using it, which is great. But sending 2 million, because that's about how many directors are still outstanding, sending 2 million emails is probably beyond what we can do. So we need to obviously make sure that we're able to send the emails that need to be sent rather than just, I suppose, blasting out 2 million emails to directors. So there are some limitations that we have in in our system, and even with our providers that send the emails for us, or the infrastructure of the email, I guess. Question here, what happens if the blue box doesn't come up? The blue box should really only come up, Peter, if all the directors have their director ID, or if they've all been emailed already, okay? So the blue box is there as a trigger for the initial email. So if the initial email has already been sent to that person, we do stop them from getting the initial email twice. Perfect for the example where you've got a director that's a director of 6 companies. The last thing we want to do is send them 6 initial emails. So if they have received their initial email, they won't receive it again. So that might be a reason why that blue box isn't coming up. But you can always send the reminder, and you can actually always send multiple reminders. A couple of other things that obviously I will show you. The email template for your director ID. So you've got the initial email here. Okay, so here's your initial email template, which you can customize. Obviously, we think we've written an okay one here, but if you want to put some more stuff in, you certainly can. And obviously, you just need to save that. And then the reminder. So with the reminder again, you can put that in and you can customize that reminder as well. So it's all done through the edit templates. Question here, do you need to send separate emails per director? Obviously, the initial email will go out company-wide, and then the reminders are per director, okay? So hopefully that answers that question. I have covered adding the ID. You can add the ID through either the alert, okay, so through the add director ID, or you can actually go to that contact and add the director ID in the contact screen. The next process is obviously the annual review. How do I get to the templates? To get to the email templates, just click on settings, email templates, and you'll notice here director ID, initial email, and director ID reminder. So hopefully that helps there. The other process is obviously the annual review. So if I go to my reviews screen, obviously I've got my annual reviews ready to process, but what we have added is the director ID alert to the annual review screen. So I can see here for my company, Daniel's BGL RegTech company, if I click on go to director IDs, I can see that I've got 2 directors that are missing their director ID. Okay, so what that means is when I go to send my annual review, I'm going to include my ABRS director ID letter. Okay, so this is the official ABRS director ID letter as part of that annual review pack. What you also might want to do is customize the annual review email template to make it a bit stronger about getting your director ID. So you can do that as well. The annual review email template, there's a lot of them in the system, a lot of customized ones in the system. So certainly you can utilize that and put the messaging that you want to put in there. You can put buttons in and links and things like that. So obviously we've got the annual review alert and then the annual review letter. And the final thing that I'll talk a bit about is the report. So what we have is a director ID report. Now this is a spreadsheet. It's a very powerful spreadsheet, but basically it is a report that exports all of your company directors out, including all of their particulars, so name and email address and things like that. And what you're going to be able to do is check who has and who hasn't got a director ID from essentially a spreadsheet point of view. So obviously you've got the alerts in CAS 360, which might give you some workflow and some features around that. But what the report, will allow you to do is actually have a really powerful spreadsheet for that. Hopefully you can utilize a lot of those features. There is a huge amount of functionality in CAS 360 to help you with this director ID, okay? And again, we will send out a webinar recording of this, so you'll be able to go through. I know sometimes we're pushed for time and we don't spend as much time as you'd like on some of these, but certainly you can obviously go through and utilize this functionality to help you manage your clients through this process. Question here, how can we confirm receipt of emails to the directors? This is all done through the outbox. Okay, so what we have in CAS 360, if you click on messages outbox, you will actually have all of your emails that you've sent and you'll have a delivery status. So what we're listening to here is the email server, okay, from the account that you've sent it to. You should always check to make sure that you've got all of your emails were delivered successfully and obviously didn't fail. If they did fail, it might be best to reach out to the client and first of all see why, and then maybe secondly, reach out to the client and maybe ask them for a better email address. All right, I will do some questions and cover off on any other sort of features that people want to have a look at the end, but I'll just go back to the content. There are a few things that are coming in the next update. So as part of our May update, we will add director ID to the quick adds. So when adding an officer, either in corporations or company officer screen, you will be able to add the director ID in there. Okay. Also, as part of the incorporation and officer appointment flow as well, we will have a field that you can, well, not a field, but actually a way that you can check to make sure that that particular officer has a director ID. The problem we have obviously in May and up until November is around making that data mandatory. Because the existing director provision still exists, it won't be a hard validation. It will be a message telling you to make sure if this person is a new director that they need their director ID, but it won't officially block it, purely because if that person is an existing director, they're just not with you as an agent for their other directorship, they're actually compliant and there's no problems. So I've got here director ID, what's next, and what do we need to know about the next phase? So what we've covered so far is up until 30th of November 2022. So let's look a bit further to September 2023, because this is where the big changes start to happen. This is where the director ID information starts connecting to the new company register, right? So the ABRS plans to automatically link some of the directors. The rest will need to be linked by you, the agent. So this is why getting those director IDs into CAS 360 is so important, because what we want to be able to do is come September 2023 is make sure that that linking can be done really seamlessly. And that come 2023, we're not searching around contacting every company director, asking them to give us the director ID that they got 2 years ago. If your clients are getting their director IDs, I strongly encourage you to get their director IDs off them. Even if they say, yes, I've got it, please reply to them saying, thank you, can you send it to me, right? Because we want to store that director ID in CAS 360 because it's going to be needed from September 2023 onwards. And the last thing we want to be doing is sending out bulk emails to directors saying, please, can you please tell me what your director ID is because you didn't tell me 2 years ago. So I'll talk a little bit about the ABRS now. So who are the ABRS? What will they do? Their roadmap and what's about to change. So the ABRS is the Australian Business Registry Service. It is a new government department specifically designed to manage registers. So this is not ASIC, which has got 15 things it needs to do, and managing registers is one of them. The ABRS's sole job will be to manage registers. They will, and have in some ways already, replaced ASIC as the registry provider. They are, for lack of a better word, part of the ATO, although there's supposed to be some invisible wall, and a big amount of funding to upgrade and take over the business registers for that function of government. So what will the ABRS do? Well, they will be the custodians of all Australian business information, make it easier for businesses to meet their registry obligations, improve the efficiency of registry transactions, and make business information more trusted and visible. Well, that's the plan anyway. So what's the roadmap? Well, from 2021, commence management of the ASIC registry. Obviously, 2021 saw the start of the rollout of Director ID, and throughout 2022, there are various changes to the Director ID legislation. In 2023 will be the implementation of a new companies register, so a whole new company register, to implement a new business names register, and implement a new professional and historical register. So in 2023 and 2024. So some big changes coming. And as I mentioned, some big changes coming. It's probably the biggest change for 30 years. It is enormous. So coming September 2023, and we're being told it's a hard cutoff, there'll be a whole new registry system. ASIC company data will be migrated to the ABRS, and everything you know, love, or hate about ASIC will be gone. So we will have a job until the end of 23. Nah, Julie, I reckon you have a job until the 2323. The creation of the ABRS agent system. Agents, a whole new agent registration process. You actually will start getting information about this, but agents are going to need to go through the process of being identified in the same way that directors are going to need to be identified. There'll be a whole new set of rules around who's delegated. So essentially the partner or the owner of the business or the firm will need to register and then give you permissions. I know we have that with our dealings with the ATO, and it's tough. It's all done via MyGovID. So basically everyone that interacts with the ATO will be, completely, fully identified. So it'll bring much more visibility to who is lodging documents. There'll still be a one-to-one company and agent relationship. That's a really important part. And really the process here is about improving and improvements as agents receiving notifications when someone is added to their agent list and things like that, and getting that data in real time. That's the sort of improvements that we're looking to see. And then the whole new companies register. Well, a whole new way of reporting changes, including the removal of ASIC forms. So the forms will be gone. There will be no more forms. Those form numbers that we've memorized, they'll be gone. Changes to company details will be facilitated by a particular transaction type, either via software or via their website. Obviously, CAS 360 will continue to prepare documents and changes so that the approval can be given. Overall, the existing lodgements will be supported in the new companies register, which will be much more modern and simpler, hopefully. And a whole heap of new lodgement services, such as financial statements, invoices, direct debit billing, a whole heap of extra things will be added to the new registries, what we're planning and what we're going through. So new register lodgements, so simpler lodgement processes as well. Client notifications, there's going to be a whole new registry business inbox that you might have seen some news about. Things like agent appointments will be sent to the company as well to the agent, so there'll be a whole heap more information. Hopefully there's some more advanced features that are being worked on that I'm not allowed to talk about too much, but hopefully things like goals that ASIC have had for a long time, like being able to update in bulk rather than lodging a change per company when there's a change of address and things like that. So, much more powerful features that I think are also a bit more logical. More flexibility in lodgements. The lodgement system is very, very rigid at the moment. And hopefully we're able to get a little bit more flexibility when we're sending things. There's sometimes when we're required to send share data, for example, for a lodgement, it's got nothing to do with shares, right? So, things like that won't happen anymore. The big one there, instant lodgement responses. The system that ASIC or the ABRS are going to use is very similar to the system that the New Zealand Companies Office uses. And it's all instant. It happens instantly. There's no waiting for a validation report. It's not a concept. You do a lodgement, you get a response. It's instant. Improved debt management tools and visibility, and hopefully much more features available for us, the software developers, to make it better for you as registered agents. So hopefully a really promising step. And we're BGL. We do have a seat at the table with the ABRS, and we're actively pushing for great features. So hopefully some really positive stuff. Changes to registry searching. This is sort of a budget announcement, but it's all bundled in. Currently there's discussion about free data and what is going to be free, but there was a budget announcement about free company searches, which is really exciting, until you sit down and have a meeting with some people at the ABRS that said, we're still working out what's free. And more information about companies will be available for free, like officer address and shareholder data. I guess where we're trying to work out is to what extent historical data is free, to what extent a document search might be free. So those sorts of things still have to come. So I think that's a whole heap of the session so far, a lot of the content. What I will do is I will take some questions or try to attempt the 61 unanswered questions. So bear with me, I'll read some of these questions and I'll get back to you. But if you do have any questions about anything we've covered today, please type them into the chat box or the Q&A preferably the Q&A because it's easier to manage, and we'll get through them. So let's go to the top. Do you know how to apply for a director ID for someone who is unable to do it themselves? Ash, it's a tough question. The legislation is really clear that the director must do it themselves. I think there might be some instances over the phone where there's able to be a support person. No different to when you're on the computer and you might have a more tech savvy person helping the person out. But really the director ID needs to be done by the director themselves. I have touched on name changes. Hopefully, Crystal, now it makes a little bit more sense once we've talked about the ABRS and the new company register, how those name changes might be a little less relevant, I guess. They might be much more, I suppose, yeah, simpler, I guess. Couple more questions here. Do we need to obtain director ID for directors that are not our clients, whereby managing companies? Where there is a director, where you are the agent, I guess it depends on your relationship with that particular business and that particular director or group of directors. Agents do not get the IDs for the directors. They are there as a facilitator to get the director ID for the directors. As I said, there are no penalties for agents. Agents are essentially the people in the middle that are trying to promote this to agents. A lot of people saying thank you. Thank you guys for coming along. If you are leaving now, thank you for coming along to the session. I hope that what we showed you today was able to be helpful. Enjoy watching the replay when it comes out. But thank you. I will continue to go through questions, but there's a lot of people saying thank you, so thank you. What happens where a person has a professional name for their business and subsequently married and has a different personal surname? I completely understand, Sue. I suppose the director is required to identify themselves through MyGovID. Once they have done that, they have a director ID. A lot of this stuff will be solved at the linking step, okay? When we go through that process and we're able to link that data together. But I would say for those people that have different names, the new system, the new company's system is going to allow for multiple names or for different names. But for those people, I'd say get their director ID, complete their process based on the name that is on their passport or driver's license. That's the key. Once they have an ID, even if ASIC come to you and say you've failed to meet the ID requirements, you can just say, no, I have, here's my ID. As I mentioned, the two systems are not connected yet, so they're not that smart. We're advised late last year that the director IDs will be available for public viewing. Has this changed? Good question. Pamela, director IDs will not be public in the transitional period, okay? They will not be public in that transitional period. Post the transitional period, I'll use the word belief. The belief, the working understanding is that they will become part of the company's search process, and that maybe some private information such as residential address might drop off. Okay, that's, I suppose, the working understanding rather than the law. But I think that that's the way that it will go, but it's certainly private during the transition process, and the transition doesn't end until the 30th of November. So it might have a few more details by then. Once a number is obtained, does the ABRS automatically get notified? Yeah, technically yes, in a long roundabout way, but basically yes, they do. They don't get notified in a way because they are the ones that issue the director ID, but I suppose they have that data in their database is probably the best way. So yes. Question here about why does the company get fined? I don't think the company gets fined. It would come down to the court case, I guess, more than anything, as to why the company would get fined if they, again, it comes down to the particular case, but there is a penalty for the company maybe if the company is gone. But thank you all for coming along to the session today. I hope it was helpful. I hope you got what you wanted out of it. We do have a survey at the end, so please fill that out. But Thank you all very, very much for coming along today. For us, it's bye for now. Thank you very much, guys.